We will now look at recognizing signs. As we have seen from our studies this far, abuse is both varied and complex. The abusive treatment of a vulnerable adult may be very obvious, such as being beaten or physically hurt. It is more likely, however, that abusive treatment will be subtle or even invisible to detect. Abuse is a negative, harmful, and illegal act. Due to its very nature, it is inflicted in a sinister but clever way by the abuser and is usually not obvious to others. Abuse can be difficult to recognize. Aging vulnerable adults are prone to lots of accidental injuries, such as falls, which can make it more difficult to decide whether injuries are a result of an accident or because of abuse. Injuries resulting from accidents are often close to the bony prominences of the body, like shins, foreheads, knees, and elbows. Injuries which may be non-accidental often include injuries that occur frequently, such as lots of bruising or cuts, some of which may look like finger marks and may be in unusual locations on the body. With physical abuse, there are visible signs, such as cuts and bruises, that alert you to the fact that abuse is happening. There are, however, many other signs of abuse that are much less obvious. Known statistics are: in 2014, 63% of reported cases of safeguarding vulnerable adults were aged 65 years or over. 60% of reported cases were related to women. 51% of people in reported cases had a physical disability, frailty, or sensory impairment. 42% of allegations took place in the home and 36% within a care home environment. The source of risk was most commonly someone known to the alleged victim. It is essential that you are able to recognize some of the less obvious signs of abuse, as described above, so that abuse can be quickly identified and corrective action taken to minimize the likelihood of it recurring. One of the easier ways to start to develop skills in recognizing the signs of the abusive treatment of vulnerable adults is to look at real-life examples. Let us take a close look at the following case study. In 2006, a gentleman named Stephen Hoskin, living in Cornwall, became a victim of abuse that he was subjected to for over a year. It was a heinous crime of torture and abuse, which eventually saw the conviction of 2 members of the gang for his murder, and 1 member was convicted of manslaughter. Stephen Hoskin had severe learning disabilities, which resulted in him behaving in a childlike behaviour. On moving Stephen into his own bedsit, due to a failure in relationship with his own mother, adult social care had diagnosed Stephen with having a substantial need and organised weekly visits, including contact with a GP. To the detriment of Stephen's life, a group of youths tricked Stephen into believing they were friends. Unbeknown to him, the youths took over his life, money, his home, forcing him to work for them. They treated him worse than an animal, keeping him on a lead inside his home, which was supposed to be his safe haven away from the world. Sadly, Stephen was forced to ingest excessive painkillers and alcohol before being taken to a nearby viaduct and enforced to go over the safety barrier, where he fell 30 metres to his death. Ultimately, his death was investigated, and the serious case review highlighted that not enough had been done to safeguard Stephen as a vulnerable adult. The investigation discovered that Stephen had been in contact with numerous agencies, i.e. Health and Social Care, the NHS, the police in the months running up to his death. Unfortunately, Stephen himself instigated the decrease of contact weeks before his death. Despite this fact, it was found that all warning indications had been missed and not enough had been done by adult social care to prevent this unnecessary murder from taking place. As a result of such a case, vast improvements have been made over recent years between agencies in vital areas to ensure better communication, working together, sharing of information, and staff training to ensure that everyone is current in their knowledge and understanding of safeguarding vulnerable adults, which strengthens their working in partnership. Data is now shared with the appropriate agencies to provide a collaborative approach. Everyone has a duty of care to others, which ensures that the well-being of vulnerable adults is paramount. Practitioners, medical or carers, must be aware of the types of abuse that could be taking place so that they can direct them to the most suitable service for assistance. Possible indicators can be: the vulnerable adult is unusually withdrawn, unexplained injuries, cuts and bruises frequently occurring, often with unacceptable explanations. The vulnerable adult flinches, shies away from physical contact. The vulnerable adult displays marks associated with self-harming. The vulnerable adult has a learning impairment. Communication is often out of context. Long-term condition. Medical issues continue without regular, any aid. Poor hygiene, clothing. Lack of belongings. Items regularly go missing, often with no valid reasons. A residential person in a care home is medicated with non-prescribed medicines to ensure they remain quiet during the nights. When questioned, a vulnerable adult explains that someone is keeping their passport and other documents safe for them. Displays lack of mental capacity and requires support to make decisions. Regular misuse of drugs and substances, both prescribed and non-prescribed. It is important we look at the support for LGBT+ people. Numerous people, whether lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and those questioning their sexuality, have difficult experiences when they reveal their sexual orientation or identity, but there is support available. Offering support to LGBT+ groups, clubs, and many different organisations in their efforts to help parents and families understand and accept. Useful definitions taken from glaad.org are: bisexual, physically, romantically and/or emotionally attracted to men and women. Coming out, people forge a lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender identity first to themselves and then may reveal it to others. Publicly identifying one's orientation may or may not be part of coming out. Gay, used to refer to a male or female whose sexual orientation is attraction to persons of the same sex and/or gender. Lesbian, a woman whose enduring physical, romantic, and/or emotional attraction is to other women. Heterosexual, used to describe people whose enduring physical, romantic, and/or emotional attraction is to people of the opposite sex, also known as straight. Homophobia, used to refer to a range of negative attitudes and feelings towards lesbian, gay, and in some cases bisexual transgender people. Homosexual, outdated clinical term considered derogatory and offensive by many gay and lesbian people. Transgender, term for people whose gender identity differs from what is typically associated with the sex they were assigned at birth. Transsexual, appearing as, wishing to be considered as, or having undergone surgery to become a member of the opposite sex. Plus, is an inclusive way to represent all the other groups of sexual and gender expressions outside of traditional norms, including non-binary, intersex, and those questioning their gender identity or sexual orientation. It is vitally important that adults get support and have opportunities to discuss issues in what can be a difficult time in their life. Understanding and supportive family members as well as additional peers, groups, etc. is critical. Despite some of the potential challenges, it is important to remember that for many young lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, it can also be a very exciting stage in their lives. Many vulnerable adults will generally know that they are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or question their sexuality or gender identity from a young age. A large number don't tell anyone until they are older. This is mainly because they are scared and worried about others' perceptions of LGBT+ people. This gap between initial questioning of their identity and starting to accept it can leave a window of time when young vulnerable adults can suffer with low self-esteem, depression, isolation, etc. Changes in legislation over recent years has ensured that in many areas of life, such as education, health, the workplace, sport, and many other day-to-day activities, LGBT plus people should enjoy and can demand the same rights as everybody else. Despite the new laws, many people still hold grudges against anyone who is perceived as different and demonstrate discriminatory attitudes or behaviours. The changes to the law mean that groups have a responsibility to provide services and support all young people and vulnerable adults, including those who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. There are things that you can do to help make sure LGBT plus vulnerable adults feel included and valued in the group, as well as identifying and challenging homophobic bullying. Providing support for LGBT plus vulnerable adults. LGBT-specific services aim to improve outcomes for LGBT plus vulnerable adults and ensure that they receive the same entitlements and quality of service as any other service user in a safe environment. All settings should aim to provide an environment where LGBT plus vulnerable adults are free to just be themselves and to experience acceptance from other adults. Providing accessible and welcoming information for LGBT plus vulnerable adults embraces diversity and creates an environment where everyone should feel valued, and LGBT plus vulnerable adults have their needs fully considered without encountering prejudice or homophobia. Good practice for working with LGBT plus vulnerable adults. Many groups already work with a wide range of young vulnerable adults from different backgrounds and with different needs. Ensuring that their services more effectively meet the needs of LGBT plus vulnerable adults is another element of this. Considering and implementing the issues listed below will help your organisation work towards best practice and allow LGBT plus vulnerable adults to feel safe and supported in and by the services they use. The organisation treats everyone with respect and fully implements equal opportunities and tackles homophobia in the same way as racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination. Anti-bullying policies consider LGBT plus issues and are visible within the group setting. The images the organisation presents and displays reflect LGBT plus diversity. Practices are open and inclusive and do not automatically assume that everyone is heterosexual. Mainstream services are available to everyone. Positive action is taken to attract a representative group of young people to attend. The service undertakes sensitive monitoring of sexuality. Staff have LGBT plus awareness training and understand the needs and vulnerabilities that LGBT vulnerable adults have. Staff teams reflect the diversity in the community in terms of sexuality, as well as race, gender, religion, ability, age, etc. There is knowledge within the organisation about the range of LGBT plus facilities and resources available, both nationally and in the local community. Helping carers. Vulnerable adults who are LGBT plus are more likely to be happy and positive about their sexual orientation or identity if their carers are there to support and understand their situation. Not every LGBT plus vulnerable adult will want their family to know about their sexual orientation or identity, and this will need to be managed carefully. When a vulnerable adult begins to question their identity or comes out, it can sometimes be a difficult time for family members. It is important to try and offer them support and signpost them onto other groups as and when required. Most family members are only concerned for the vulnerable adult's well-being and would find it difficult to think about their family member being bullied about their sexual orientation or identity. Family may be worried what impact this bullying will have on the vulnerable adult and their future life. Some carers struggle with the issues raised either due to their own beliefs, values, or ignorance, and it is important to try and maintain a balanced position when discussing the topic with them. Providing them with advice or information can be helpful. Where LGBT plus vulnerable adults experience a difficult relationship with their peers as a result of coming out, other adults or agencies that will offer support and listen to your needs could include other family members, GPs, local council services, care workers, specific LGBT plus services, helplines, clubs, etc. The Government Equalities Office released a policy paper on Tuesday, 3rd of July 2018, titled LGBT Action Plan 2018, Improving the Lives of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Transgender People. This can be found on the www.gov.uk website under Government Publications. The policy explains how the government will advance the rights of LGBT+ people, both at home and abroad, and improve the way that public services work for them. Their vision is for everyone, regardless of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or sex characteristics, to be able to live safe, happy, and healthy lives where they can be themselves without fear of discrimination. The government has allocated funding up until March 2020 to deliver the plan, and they will look to secure additional funding beyond March 2020 when departmental budgets are set later in Parliament. To help guide and deliver this plan, they will establish a new LGBT+ advisory panel for government. We will now look at safer recruitment. If you run a voluntary, faith or community group, you need to make sure that the people that work for you, either paid or voluntary, have been recruited using correct recruitment and vetting procedures. By following the correct procedures, you will be preventing unsuitable people from working with vulnerable adults in your organisation. This means that you need to do thorough checks on all applicants as part of the recruitment process, and references are always taken up prior to employment and registration. This includes the appointment of senior managers, committee members, and volunteers. There may be individuals that you already know in your community that would like to volunteer their time to your organisation. You may feel that because you know them that they would not wish to hurt a vulnerable adult, but sadly this may not be the case. It is important that you follow the same rigorous recruitment process for people that you know as you would when employing the services of any other member of staff. Organisations must ensure they have in place safe recruitment policies and procedures, including disclosure and barring service checks for all relevant staff, including agency staff, students, and volunteers working with vulnerable adults. This means that the people in your organisation who are involved in the recruitment and selection of workers or volunteers should attend a safer recruitment training course. A safer recruitment process for both paid and volunteer roles should include specific time set aside for planning the process and structure of the recruitment process. People within the organisation who are involved in the recruitment and selection of staff should have attended safer recruitment training. Clear job role and person specifications, setting down the boundaries and expectations of the role, including a statement of responsibility and requirements for safeguarding. Your commitment to safeguarding should be included in any job advert. It is essential to ensure that no individual takes up employment or voluntary work with vulnerable adults until identity, references, and relevant DBS checks have been completed. Face-to-face interviews are always conducted. The use of application forms, not CVs. Clear messages about your organisation's commitment to safeguarding should be sent to candidates from the outset. The Disclosure and Barring Service, DBS. The Disclosure and Barring Service, created from the previous Criminal Records Bureau, CRB, and Independent Safeguarding Authority, ISA, formed on 1st of December 2012. The purpose of this list is to identify adults who have been deemed unsuitable to work with vulnerable adults in any capacity. Sex Offenders Register. The Sex Offenders Register contains the details of anyone convicted, cautioned, or released from prison for sexual offence against children or adults since September 1997, when it was set up. The register, which is run by the police, is not retrospective, so does not include anyone convicted before 1997. It was documented in October 2017 that the number of registered sex offenders living in the community has risen by more than 80% in a decade. More than 55,000 rapists, paedophiles, and other sex offenders are living under supervision by police and probation services. A report from the Ministry of Justice showed that the number on the sex offender register has risen 82% from 30,416 in 2006-2007 to 55,236 in 2016-2017. The Vulnerable Adult Safeguarding Manager. Choosing a safeguarding manager for vulnerable adults. It is recommended that at least one person in your organisation is a designated vulnerable adult safeguarding manager. This person will take the lead on safeguarding for your organisation. In the NHS, a nominated safeguarding senior officer, NSSO, will be appointed to ensure that an adult at risk referral is made to the relevant adult social care team and, where appropriate, the police, using the required reporting form as detailed in the local policies and procedures for your area. The referral must be put in writing to adult social care by the individual reporting the concerns within 24 hours or, in the event of a weekend, the earliest opportunity of the next working day. Where the issue is in relation to safeguarding children, the nominated safeguarding senior officer will liaise with the local authority designated officer, LADO, who will agree with the nominated safeguarding senior officer, NSSO, any information that needs to be shared with other geographical areas depending on where the staff member lives. The LADO can be contacted through the local social care team or the LSCB contact lead. Immediate issues of investigation and management of the employee should be discussed and agreed at this time, including what information should be passed to the staff member concerned at this point. Where the issue is in relation to an adult at risk of harm or abuse, the NSSO will discuss the case and allegations with the police and the relevant adult social care department manager and identify which agency will be leading on the investigation. Nominating someone to undertake the role may be the first task your group should consider. The person chosen should be someone with authority in the group, such as a manager or team leader, a paid member of staff if possible, have a disclosure and barring service (DBS) check, have at least 2 references which are followed up. You may wish to consider appointing a deputy in case of sickness or leave. Responsibilities. The designated safeguarding officer are the first point of contact for all staff and volunteers to go to for advice if they are concerned about a vulnerable adult. This may also need to be out of hours, so staff and volunteers should always know how to contact them, or you can also appoint a deputy. They have a higher level of safeguarding training and knowledge than the rest of the staff and should have completed a Level 3 in safeguarding. They are responsible for ensuring that their organisation's safeguarding policy is kept up to date. They ensure that they comply with safer recruitment procedures, as we have observed in previous unit, for new staff members and their induction, ensuring all key staff are trained to Level 2 and support staff to Level 1 minimum. They support staff to assist in information regarding concerns and support decision-making about whether staff concerns are sufficient enough to notify adult social work services or whether other courses of action are more appropriate. They make formal referrals to the adult safeguarding team. They ensure that concerns are logged and stored securely. They have joint responsibility with the management committee or board of trustees to ensure that the organisation's safeguarding policy and related policies and procedures are followed and regularly updated. They are responsible for promoting a safe environment for vulnerable adults. They know the contact details of relevant statutory agencies, i.e. Adult Social Services, Adult Social Care Team, ASWS, Police, Local Safeguarding Adult Board, SAB, and the Local Authority Designated Officer, LADO, or appropriate authority figure for allegations against staff. It is not the responsibility of the designated safeguarding officer to decide whether a vulnerable adult has been abused or not. That is the responsibility of investigative statutory agencies, such as Adult Social Care Team or the police. However, keeping adults safe is everybody's business, and all staff should know who to go to and how to report any concerns they may have about a vulnerable adult being harmed or at risk of being harmed. Training. Once a member has been DBS checked and verified, they are able to start work with vulnerable adults. It is good practice that all staff delivering care and support to vulnerable adults must have training as part of their compulsory induction process to their role and have regular ongoing training in regular intervals. The designated safeguarding lead and any deputies should participate in safeguarding of vulnerable adults (SOVA) training, such as this, and keep updated every 2 years. It is also important that they update their knowledge and skills regularly, at least annually, to ensure they are up to date with any changes and developments relevant to their role. If you are the designated safeguarding officer for your organisation, we recommend that you register with your local safeguarding board to ensure that you are kept up to date with all the latest safeguarding information from the board and details of events and training. Let us look at prevention. As you are now aware, the aim of a safeguarding adults policy is to improve safeguarding for adults that are vulnerable to risk of harm, abuse, exploitation, or neglect. There is significant importance on policies and procedures regarding prevention and early intervention. These policies are there to ensure all organisations who work with vulnerable adults. It can often be difficult to assess what can make successful prevention due to the fact that the majority of abuse and neglect occurs in secrecy, making it difficult to prove that abuse is happening. Equally, a reduction in referrals could be an indicator that staff are not aware of what they're looking for regarding signs of abuse. The key to the prevention of abuse is that by placing the vulnerable adult at the centre and giving them a voice in which to express their concern and best to deal with the situation can have a positive impact on the welfare of the vulnerable adult. Safeguarding is unable to work without the vulnerable adult feeling like they have empowerment, which is number 1 of the safeguarding principles, which we have observed earlier and they are discussed again later, as they are at the forefront of the Statutory Guidance of Care and Support 2016. It is important that everyone is aware of risk assessments. All written records must be clear and accurate, based entirely on facts and free from personal opinions. This is particularly important should a criminal prosecution go to court. All reports, regardless of the type of case, are to be written in the correct format and that those involved do exactly what they're supposed to do. A risk assessment should contain the practitioner reporting the risk, field of work, for example, adult social care team, area location, the patient's information, the history of the case, the risk in question, the risk factor, the outcome. There may be additional factors that are to be taken into consideration, such as the adult's mental capacity, dementia, autism, etc. At the centre of the decision is the person-centred approach, where the vulnerable adult's individual rights will be upheld and supported by the adult social care team. Where there is support from the family, this will also be taken into consideration. If the vulnerable adult displays a reluctance to participate, it can make things extremely difficult to assess the full extent of the risks and their needs. It is imperative that you have the full engagement of the vulnerable adult as much as possible. We will look carefully at responsibilities. Responsibilities for practitioners and care services. It is important that anyone who works to safeguard vulnerable adults does so in a way that is set out by the Care Quality Commission's fundamental standards of quality and safety. It may be viewed that practitioners are neglecting or abusing someone if they cause harm to the vulnerable adult, or they do not follow practices that should be preventing harm to the vulnerable adult. The Code of Conduct for Healthcare Support Workers and Adult Social Care Workers in England, 2013, set out guidelines in which support worker practitioners must follow. Be accountable by making sure you can answer for your actions or omissions. Promote and uphold the privacy, dignity, rights, health and well-being of people who use health and care services and their carers at all times. Work in collaboration with your colleagues to ensure the delivery of high-quality, safe and compassionate healthcare, care and support. Communicate in an open and effective way to promote the health, safety, and well-being of people who use health and care services and their carers. Respect a person's right to confidentiality. Strive to improve the quality of healthcare, care and support through continuing professional development. Uphold and promote equality, diversity, and inclusion. The following professionals should follow the relevant standards and code of conduct, which includes teachers, lecturers, doctors, nurses, midwives, adult social workers, those connected to the medical field, for example, paramedics, therapists, occupational therapists, physiotherapists. Practitioners are reminded that their responsibilities include ensuring that their actions or omissions do not harm an individual's health or well-being, and they must never abuse, neglect, harm, or exploit those who use health and care services. Practitioners must ensure that the vulnerable adults in their care are treated as individuals, regardless of their age, gender, beliefs, sexual orientation, ethnicity, mental and/or physical disabilities. It is imperative that the safety of vulnerable adults is placed first at all times before any loyalty to the practitioner's friends or colleagues or any personal or organisational aims. As we have now established, it is the responsibility of everyone to ensure that vulnerable adults are to be supported and protected from the risk of harm. Therefore, each establishment needs to ensure that all staff have a duty to report any concerns or suspicions that a vulnerable adult is at risk of harm. They understand what their role involves. The safety and welfare of the vulnerable adult is prioritised and central to the care given, respecting the rights of the individual throughout. Staff are familiar with all policies relating to safeguarding vulnerable adults. Staff who raise concerns are protected from any potential repercussion and treated fairly. Both staff and volunteers receive adequate training that is suitable to their level of responsibility. Supervision is given, allowing the member of staff the opportunity to reflect on their training and the effect of their actions on others around them. Let us look at disclosure. Through working with vulnerable adults of all ages, you will have developed some skills in identifying some of the signs of abuse. There may be occasions when a vulnerable adult discloses to you about abuse that he or she has suffered. Unfortunately, the majority of vulnerable adults will not wish to talk about what is happening to them. In a situation where a vulnerable adult discloses, your role is to simply find out just enough about the alleged abuse in order to make a decision about whether or not the disclosure should be referred. If an adult does choose to disclose a concern they are having difficulty with, it is important the practitioner takes the time to listen, are sensitive throughout, and responds appropriately to their needs. You may need to ask the vulnerable adult or clarify what is being said. Ensure in these cases that you never use questions that will lead the adult to give you a certain reply. In these situations, you must use open questions, such as, "Please explain to me what happened. Can you explain a little more? Can you tell me more about?" It is essential that you do not contaminate any of the evidence provided by the vulnerable adult by asking leading questions or putting words into the adult's mouth, as this could affect the case should it end in court. Remember, if a vulnerable adult chooses to disclose to you, it will be because you are an individual who the adult views as significant and who they can trust. It is essential for the vulnerable adult that the person they disclose to is supportive. Vulnerable adults will often give you small clues over time. Be supportive each time this happens, as this encourages further disclosure when the adult feels ready. Never push the adult by asking too many questions. It is better to offer support and allow the adult the space to disclose in his or her own words, in their own time. Any individual working with vulnerable adults can, at any time, during their work, be faced with a vulnerable adult who wants to talk to you about an abusive situation. When this occurs, it is essential that you are aware of what is going on and your responsibility in relation to disclosure, reporting, referring, processes that are followed by agencies following referral. If a vulnerable adult discloses to you, it is essential that you make sure that he or she realizes that you take very seriously what is said. Listen carefully. Let the vulnerable adult know how brave you think he or she is to tell you and that you understand how hard it must be, reassuring them that they were right to tell you. Do not jump to conclusions or give your own opinion, good or bad, to the raised concern. Ensure the vulnerable adult does not feel that she or he is to blame. Remain calm and reassuring. Do not show disbelief, shaking of the head, shock, etc. Explain that you cannot promise to keep what the vulnerable adult tells you a secret. Explain you have a duty to inform their line manager in order to keep them safe from risk of harm. Inform them that you may have to involve a social worker or police officer in order to maintain safety. Clearly, simply, explain what will happen next. We'll continue to offer support, reassuring them that they will be involved in the decision-making process. Record complete, accurate, unbiased, factual, and legible notes. Let us look at these key steps a little more closely. During the disclosure, if it's possible, you should write down phrases and words whilst the vulnerable adult is talking. These will be useful to trigger your memory when you come to recall and record your full notes following the disclosure. This should only be done if the vulnerable adult agrees and is comfortable with you writing things down. Immediately following the disclosure. Immediately after the disclosure, it is very important to record exactly what the vulnerable adult said, in as much detail as you can remember. It is very important to use the vulnerable adult's own words and vocabulary, even if the words do not make a great deal of sense. What is very important is that there is an accurate record of what the vulnerable adult actually said and not your interpretation of what was said. Your own responses. Your verbal and non-verbal response should be accurately recorded. It is very important that it is clear that you used a non-leading approach. The environmental context of the disclosure. The environmental context in which the vulnerable adult decided to disclose the abuse can be valuable information later on for the investigation. For example, listening to a discussion on a radio program could trigger emotions of how they are feeling about a situation. The emotional context of the disclosure. The emotional context will provide valuable signs to the investigating team. The vulnerable adult may have made serious statements in a joking fashion or may have been upset and concerned. Vulnerable adults may speak about very serious matters in a direct way, which can be a surprise for those caring for them. Repetition. If a vulnerable adult repeats statements or certain words, these should be recorded. Reliability in a vulnerable adult's repeated statements gives the evidence strength. It is important that the practitioner gains the agreement of the vulnerable adult prior to reporting a safeguarding concern. This may not always be possible, especially those who are unable to give the consent themselves, i.e., those who lack mental capacity. However, in the majority of cases, the concerns raised must always be agreed with the vulnerable adult first before reporting. At all times, it must be considered whether it is in the interests of the vulnerable adult that a safeguarding concern is raised. Remember, vulnerable adults often retract allegations of abuse. This does not discredit the allegation, but should prompt questions about why the allegation has been withdrawn. Possible reasons that vulnerable adults will often not wish to disclose what is happening to them. They may feel uncomfortable and embarrassed, feel like they can't talk about it, may have a disability or mental disability that does not allow them to disclose their concerns, may be afraid of the overall impact on their life, especially if cared for by family. They have become dependent upon their abuser. They believe the abuse is normal behavior. They do not think that anyone will believe them or will understand what is happening. They wish for the abuse to cease, but not sure how or where to begin to make it stop. You must not physically examine the vulnerable adult without their consent. This is the role of the medically trained professional. If there are marks that are easily visible, then record what you can see. Do not look under, open, or remove a vulnerable adult's clothes to examine injuries. It is a difficult decision as to whether or not it is acceptable to touch a vulnerable adult who is disclosing abuse, as touching, patting, or hugging may have a very different meaning to the vulnerable adult. Vulnerable adults that have been abused often do not have the sense of limits or understand they need to stay safe, so you must be cautious when showing your understanding and empathy. The use of other means, such as voice, non-verbal behavior, can be helpful in these situations. If an adult is unsure of what to do next, there are many avenues that the practitioner can take to gain advice. They can speak to their colleagues, preferably their line manager, who may highlight that they also have their concerns. Adult social care can be contacted, in addition to the Social Care Institute for Excellence, SCIE, and local Safeguarding Adults Board, who can advise on policies and procedures. You may find that after seeking advice that you no longer wish to report the concern, and you may do some further research first to investigate whether there have been any previous reported concerns, or it may be that you decide to monitor the situation to observe whether the concerns increase, with the thought process that adult social care will be contacted for further advice or to make a referral. We will now look at reporting. Anyone, professional, staff, or volunteer, must highlight any concerns as early as possible. Whether the act has been heard, seen, or overheard, if they believe there is a genuine need to share information for the safety of the vulnerable adult. As observed earlier, the role of a vulnerable adult safeguarding manager is to ensure that staff members understand that they must raise their concerns directly to them or to adult social care. Any concerns must be raised with the highest role in the establishment, particularly if the allegations involve their direct manager. If the vulnerable adult has requested that you do not share the concern with anyone, you cannot uphold that guarantee and have a responsibility to act in the best interests of the vulnerable adult, particularly if it places them at further risk of harm. Once you have decided to share your concern, you will have to share the exact details, explaining the possible abuse that is taking place or could occur should it go unaddressed. Any records made at the time of disclosure can become court evidence. It is essential that such records are clear, legible, free from interpretation, and a true reflection of the facts themselves presented at the time. A vulnerable adult may need to be moved immediately if they are at risk of danger. Emergency services may need to be called if appropriate, including the police, to ensure the safety of the vulnerable adult. All incidents must be fully recorded as soon as possible. If the vulnerable adult is not in need of immediate removal, then it may be that once the concerns have been raised with the manager, there are several things that need to be considered. As you are aware, all concerns need to be recorded, dated, signed, and taken forward for action. However, where the concern involves a care establishment, referrals must be made to the appropriate inspection authority, e.g., Care Quality Commission, CQC, for health and social care, who have a statutory responsibility to investigate any concerns. It can be extremely distressing for a vulnerable adult to disclose a concern. Therefore, when making a decision on whether to refer or not, it must be considered that this is an area that is not often discussed, and only by speaking up on behalf of the vulnerable adult that they will receive the support and safety they require. The assumption should never be made that someone else is dealing with the situation that has been observed. Any concerns, no matter how small, if it places the vulnerable adult at risk, they should report these concerns immediately to the suitable person who holds responsibility for safeguarding. Recording. Any records made at the time of disclosure can become court evidence. It is essential that such records are clear, legible, free from biased opinion, and a true reflection of what actually happened. Records should never be your interpretation of the facts, but purely the facts themselves as they are presented at the time. It is important to note that your records should be more than just notes of what was said. Let's look at some rules about making effective records at the time of a disclosure. Recording during the disclosure. If it's possible, you should write down phrases and words whilst the vulnerable adult is talking. These will be useful to trigger your memory when you come to recall and record your full notes following the disclosure. This should only be done if the vulnerable adult agrees and is comfortable with you writing things down. Recording immediately following the disclosure. Immediately after the disclosure, it is very important to record exactly what the vulnerable adult said in as much detail as you can remember. It is very important to use the vulnerable adult's own words and vocabulary, even if the words do not make a great deal of sense. What is very important is that there is an accurate record of what the vulnerable adult actually said and not your interpretation of what was said. Recording your own responses. Your verbal and non-verbal response should be accurately recorded. It is very important that it is clear that you used a non-leading approach. Recording the environmental context of the disclosure. The environmental context in which the vulnerable adult decided to disclose the abuse can be valuable information later on for the investigating team. Recording the emotional context of the disclosure. The emotional context will provide valuable clues to the investigating team. The vulnerable adult may have made serious statements in a joking fashion or may have been upset and distressed. Vulnerable adults may speak about very serious matters in a matter-of-fact way, which can be a surprise for the person they are disclosing to. Recording repetition. If a vulnerable adult repeats statements or certain words, these should be recorded. Consistency in a vulnerable adult's repeated statements gives the evidence strength. Referrals. To refer or not to refer. It is easy to make excuses not to refer a case of actual or suspected abuse. Abuse of vulnerable adults is shrouded in a world of secrecy and silence. It is only when such silence is broken that abused vulnerable adults have any chance of protection. If you hear any allegation of abuse, it takes courage to start the vulnerable adult protection process on the adult's behalf. There are known factors that prevent adults taking the first steps in helping to break a cycle of abuse. Those who wish to help vulnerable adults who they suspect are being abused often may not refer allegations of abuse for a variety of reasons, including a fear of exposing the vulnerable adult to further abuse, a fear of causing family problems, fear of punishment, concern of having to appear in court, a worry that you have misinterpreted or overreacted to the situation, assumption that somebody else will deal with the problem, convincing yourself everything will be all right with time. The vulnerable adult is fantasizing or lying. There can be many reasons why you may not want to refer a disclosure. If you do not speak up, the vulnerable adult could be placed at greater risk. It is essential to remember, however, that by speaking up, it will probably be your referral that will inevitably lead to breaking the cycle of abuse endured by the vulnerable adult. How do you make a referral? Adult social care should acknowledge a written referral within 1 working day of receiving the report. It is very important that if the report has not been acknowledged within 3 working days, then it is good practice for the designated safeguarding person to follow this up and contact adult social care again. It is important that all phone calls are followed up in writing. By doing this, it ensures that you, your establishment, and social care have a written document of the clear facts which can be referred to and presented when required. If you work for an organisation, whether as a paid member of staff or as a volunteer, you must follow the internal guidelines. Local adult protection procedures will provide clear guidelines on how to make a referral to adult social services and police in your area. Most establishments will hold a safeguarding adults policy, often known as a SOVA/POVA policy, which explains clearly what you should do if you have a concern. It is comforting to know that there is someone available at all times to speak with, including evenings and weekends. As we have observed earlier, many establishments have a designated safeguarding manager for those to speak with. They may be known by an alternative name, e.g., safeguarding officer, designated lead, etc. Staff would do well to familiarise themselves. If medical attention is urgently required, then you must refer directly to the hospital. All referrals must be made to adult social care. You can refer anonymously, but it is much better to provide your details so that further information can be obtained. Details about the report. The following information is helpful to everyone involved so that a full representation of the circumstances can be identified in the referral. Full name, including any aliases or nicknames if known, of the vulnerable adult. Date of birth, gender, nationality, address, telephone or mobile phone numbers. Your name and role as the concerned person. What the concern is regarding, where it took place, when it took place, date and time. What was heard, seen, exact words. The names of any other people present, what you were doing at the time. Details of any other previous acts of abuse which may be relevant. Full details of the abuser, if known. Details of concerns raised and to whom in addition to any actions taken. It is understandable that much of the above information may not be available to you. However, the more information you can supply, the greater the chance there will be for the police to check out the individuals concerned, which is essential for the future safety of the vulnerable adult. Informing family members. The agencies will work in partnership with families, communicating openly and honestly with them. There may be times, however, when it will not be in the vulnerable adult's interest for the family to be informed prior to a vulnerable adult's interview. You should usually seek advice before speaking to family members. Remember that every case is unique and will require its own strategy. Be careful about taking on too much responsibility yourself. Informing colleagues in your establishment. Information should only be shared on a need-to-know basis. Certain information may need to be shared immediately in order to protect the vulnerable adult. Other decisions about sharing information will be made later by managers and staff from the agencies. Post-referrals. Following a referral, there are a number of stages that take place. These are out of your hands and are managed by the local authority and police. The post-referral process involves a number of key stages, namely, adult social care's response and decision made relating to the vulnerable adult, establishment, strategy meeting, inquiries, if taken place, case conference, assessment and protection plan, review of the protection plan, discontinuation of the protection plan. Adult social care's response and decision. Social care will make an informed decision whether the vulnerable adult requires urgent attention or not. They will also determine what services may be required to assist the vulnerable adult or whether they require further assessments. If social care do not believe there is a risk to the vulnerable adult, they may decide that their involvement is not necessary. If the decision is that they do not wish to be involved, they must offer you guidance on how best you can deal with the situation. It is important to note that if you do not agree with the decision made by the adult social care, there are alternative options for you to pursue. For example, review your report with your line manager and ask the manager of the adult social care team for them to do another assessment of their decision. You can always go back to adult social care at a later date with further evidence of additional concerns made by other professionals and with the agreement of your designated safeguarding person. The local Safeguarding Adults Board can also be consulted and will be able to offer information on the course of action to take next after an unsatisfactory outcome of a referral. The board will also share details on what you must do if you believe a professional's conduct is questionable and not indicating that they are following policies and procedures. Strategy meeting. Where adult social care have agreed to take action on the case in question, they will call for a meeting to be held. This is a professionals-only meeting called by social services and chaired by a team manager. It will include the person who initially made the referral, social care, health services, the police, and any other appropriate services. The purpose of the meeting is to share information amongst the agencies and professionals to enable discussion and analysis and to plan and agree the action needed to safeguard the vulnerable adult and/or provide interim services and support. It may be discussed whether an independent mental capacity advocate, IMCA, is required to represent the vulnerable adult's best interests if they have no other person, family or friend, to do this for them. During the meeting, the professionals will look at several of the following aspects of the case: decision with regards to whether the inquiry will happen or not, the requests of the vulnerable adult, commence a risk assessment, decide on a temporary protection plan, a clear record of the choices decided and what details were shared, inquiry and communication plans agreed upon with timelines, observe and decide if any children under 18 years old may be at risk. Inquiries. Inquiries involves the sharing of information amongst social workers and working together with other people who have a duty to look after vulnerable adults, such as doctors, health visitors, teachers and police officers. Case conference. If needed, an adult protection conference will involve all the key people involved with the vulnerable adult and their family. The conference is designed to collate and analyse information about the vulnerable adult to enable judgment on the probability of the vulnerable adult suffering future significant harm and to agree future action needed to protect the vulnerable adult. As a result of a protection conference for a vulnerable adult, whom it is agreed there is a likelihood of significant harm, a protection plan will be put together. Assessment and protection plan. A doctor must not examine a vulnerable adult any more than is absolutely necessary. For example, a general practitioner could complete the examination of a bruise, whereas sexual abuse may need examination by a forensic medical examiner and a consultant. Examination must be conducted with consent. Without consent, can be classed in law as assault. Sharing of information. To achieve the best outcomes for vulnerable adults, to promote their welfare and safeguard them from harm, agencies need to work together. Vulnerable adult needs and circumstances can be complex, and it is only by agencies coming together and working collaboratively that we can achieve a holistic assessment of the vulnerable adult within their family and community and ensure that they receive the services that they need. Effective interagency working is dependent upon effective information sharing, whether a vulnerable adult just needs some additional support, early intervention, or whether there are concerns that they are at risk of significant harm, safeguarding. Early intervention. Where a professional believes that it is necessary to share information to help them to better understand the needs of a vulnerable adult or to enable the vulnerable adult to receive a service from another agency, and the vulnerable adult is not at risk of significant harm, they should seek the consent of a carer before requesting the information or contacting the other agency. This will ensure that the family understand the issues and are more engaged with any services provided by agencies. Safeguarding. Effective joint working can be undermined by poor communication, and several serious case reviews have highlighted poor information sharing as a factor. For this reason, CARE Act 2014 stipulates that the Act creates a legal framework so key organisations and individuals with responsibilities for adult safeguarding can agree on how they must work together and what roles they must play to keep vulnerable adults at risk safe from harm. It is important that professionals share information in an appropriate and timely fashion. Professionals should, without delay, discuss with their line manager or designated safeguarding lead the need to share information where there are concerns about a vulnerable adult. Information should be shared with consent of the vulnerable adult wherever possible. The law does not prevent the sharing of information where there is evidence that sharing of information is necessary to support a police investigation or there could be a risk to the public, e.g., where a serious crime could have been prevented. Key points on information sharing. Explain at the outset, openly and honestly, what and how information will be shared. Always consider the safety and welfare of a vulnerable adult when making decisions on whether to share information about them. Seek consent to share confidential information. You may still share information if, in your judgment, there is sufficient need to override the lack of consent. Seek advice where you are in doubt without disclosing the identity of the vulnerable adult. Ensure the information is accurate and up to date, necessary, shared only with those people who need to see it, and shared securely. Important to remember that the Data Protection Act is not a barrier for sharing information, but that what information is shared is done appropriately. Always record the reasons for your decision, whether it is to share information or not. If you share the information, you must record what information you have shared and with whom. Additional information. Information sharing. Guidance for practitioners and managers. Information sharing. Advice for practitioners. March 2015. Safeguarding Adults. NHS Pocket Guide. www.england.nhs.uk/wp-content/uploads/2017/02/adult-pocket-guide.pdf. Safeguarding Principles. There are 6 key principles set out in the Care Act 2014 that reinforce all work taken to safeguard vulnerable adults. These are: Principle 1. Empowerment. Adults ask for what they want and receive support that is personal to them and have given their consent. Principle 2. Prevention. Signs are recognised and clear, decisive. Actions are taken before harm occurs to the vulnerable adult. Principle 3. Proportionality. Professionals to work in the vulnerable adult's best interests and responses are proportionate to the presented risks. Principle 4. Protection. Professionals to provide help and support for those in the greatest need. Principle 5. Partnership. Professional services within the local community join together to share only the information that prevents, detects, and reports neglect and abuse. Principle 6. Accountability. Safeguarding of vulnerable adults should be delivered with transparency and accountability. Therefore, the adult fully understands the role of everyone in their life. Whistleblowing. All organisations must have a whistleblowing policy, which is covered by legislation. The policy must set out how a person discloses concerns, how the disclosure is handled, the nature of whistleblowing, and the possible outcomes from a whistleblowing disclosure. Whistleblowing involves highlighting a concern that is in the public interest to explore and determine, e.g. fraud, financial malpractice, giving and receiving of bribes, crimes, acts that may place the vulnerable adult in danger or to the environment. The Public Interest Disclosure Act 1999 protects employees from unfair treatment if they raise any concerns regarding malpractice in good faith as set out by the law. Changes made in the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act 2013 changed the belief from in good faith to in the public interest. It is important that the whistleblower is aware that they are protected by the law, that they'll be treated fairly, and their job is secure, regardless of the whistleblowing that can be raised at any time. The concern can be related to an incident that happened in the past, is happening presently, or believed to happen soon. Those that whistleblow are encouraged by the law to raise concerns referring to negligence or misconduct in their work environment to ensure that the setting responds appropriately by not covering up serious malpractice, handle the message, not the messenger, and protect the whistleblower from repercussions, e.g. being given their notice or mistreated. An establishment's whistleblowing policy may advise the concerned person to speak to their manager. However, this may not always be possible, particularly if the concern relates to their manager. In this situation, it should be referred directly to adult social care. If the registered setting is the concern, then it must be reported to the Care Quality Commission. Adult social care can give advice if the person is unsure whether it applies to their concern or not. It is important to think of the bigger picture when feeling apprehensive about reporting a concern. Although it may be difficult to raise this matter, it is vital to think of the consequences if the concerns are not dealt with, causing the situation to spiral or is overlooked. Protection plans. A protection plan is established with the purpose of ensuring the vulnerable adult is protected from further harm, immediately and in the future. The aim is to ensure the vulnerable adult health and well-being is a priority. This is incorporated into the services, therapies, and treatments that the vulnerable adult may require. The plan is put into action and carefully followed to assess for ongoing risks of harm to the vulnerable adult. The responsibility of the protection plan to safeguard it is being followed lies with the main group of professionals. Review of the protection plan. It is essential the protection plans are reviewed on a regular basis. Review meetings are held with the purpose to assess whether the agreed actions have taken place effectively and a decision made as to whether the protection plan continues or is further adapted. It is recommended that review conferences are held every 6 months following the initial meeting. This ensures that the protection plans are current and allows the progress of the vulnerable adult to be maintained. Discontinuation of the protection plan. It may be that the vulnerable adult has made significant improvements and the review conference highlights that they no longer require a protection plan. If it is agreed within the meeting that a protection plan is not necessary, then the safeguarding process can be closed. This can be done at any time as long as all procedures have been followed and the vulnerable adult is not considered to be at risk of harm.